Hi, and welcome to today's webinar by CM Medical. I'm your host, Emil Larson, and I'm a talent solution specialist who serves the medical imaging market. But we're not here today to talk about that. This webinar is all about how to break into the European market in medical imaging. And to discuss this subject, I'm delighted to be joined by a panel of leaders within this space. Before we get better introduced to them, I just want to remind everybody attending that we'll be running a live Q&A later on. So if you have any questions, please submit them through to our Q&A chat, and we'll do our best to address as many as possible. Anyway, let's get started by meeting today's panel. Peter, first of all, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what you do at Quibim and the company?
Yes, thank you, Emil. So the name is Peter Seegers. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer for Quibim. Quibim is a Spanish company. We specialize in quantitative biomarker in imaging, in medical imaging. We have several products, AI products for the clinical market, but we also do a lot of data management, biomarker discovery for pharma and CRO partners. I've been in the medical industry for over 25 years. And of those 25 years, about half of that I spent in the US, the other half in Europe. So I think I can compare the two different markets, being in both of them. And of the 25 years, probably about 20 years of them in the medical imaging. That's also where Quibim is active at the moment.
Excellent. And Rachel?
Yeah, hi, I'm Rachel Gerson. I'm a radiologist. I'm currently based in the US. I also do consulting in clinical implementation of AI and health innovation solutions for the medical space across the healthcare spectrum, with a particular interest in systems improvement as it relates to radiologists and to radiologists' workflow. And I have been a consultant radiologist for a telemedicine clinic based in Barcelona and reading for the UK. So I'm also licensed in the UK. And I do fellowships and mentorship there as well. And I have a particular interest in the broader international markets for these up-and-coming innovation tools. So I hope to bring the clinical perspective to this conversation.
Exactly, and I think we're very well positioned for today's conversation, with Peter offering more from a commercial perspective, yourself Rachel from more of a clinical perspective. The two worlds cannot sort of cope without each other, I suppose, when we talk about imaging. So we're very well placed. And I wanted to kick things off by, first of all, Rachel, putting to you, what are the barriers for entry for medical imaging companies in Europe? And we can explore that conversation with Peter getting involved, of course, as well.
Yeah, well, of course, it's a broad topic. But I think both in Europe and in the US, one of the big barriers is really understanding the problem of your customer. Right. And I think, as you mentioned, kind of the business space or the tech space and the clinical space are sometimes siloed from each other. And bridging that gap is really important. So what is the problem you're trying to solve? You having a great idea, a tool that has lots of bells and whistles, or it's very appealing for its diagnostic utility. If it doesn't solve a problem that the clinical people are trying to have or currently have, and they're trying to solve themselves, then it's not useful. And I think there are differences between the US and Europe in terms of what those problems are, what those challenges are, but really spending time getting to know your customer. How does their workflow work? How do they integrate with the larger healthcare system? Obviously in Europe, that can be a different model than from country to country, and also with regards to the US versus, smaller private practices, how they relate to the hospitals they work for, versus in Europe, national healthcare systems and how doctors integrate with those. And it's different from country to country. So understanding those differences across different countries in Europe, but also understanding on the day-to-day level, how do those physicians and patients interact with that healthcare system?
No, exactly. I couldn't agree more. And Peter, from your perspective initially?
Yeah, I think, I'm totally in line with Rachel. The difference is, understanding your customer. And I think the problem in Europe, what you see is that the customers, if you travel 100, 150 miles, then your customer changes. So the need and the behavior of your customer changes. I just looked at some statistics and some numbers, comparison like America to the US. And I think, if you think about US and Europe, you would say, okay, it's about similar, right? Similar what the GDP concerns. The US is slightly higher than Europe, but Europe has almost twice the number of population than in the US. But in the US, you speak one language, right? You have 50 states. They're all one language and sort of the same behavior, the same healthcare system. It's very similar. But in Europe, with double the amount of people and half the size of the US, you have 50 countries, right? And each country has its own healthcare system that is unique. And within that, there's also in Europe, there's an official 24 languages, right? So you travel a couple of hundred miles in the States, you're still in the same state, or at least the same language, the same insurance system. But if you do the same in Europe, you're totally in a different country with different culture, different language, a totally different healthcare system. And that makes Europe a little bit more challenging.
Exactly. And, that's also from my perspective as well, from dealing with companies, you can do so well in your domestic market because you gain the traction, you have local investors. If we're talking about the smaller companies in the space as well, the word is spread very quickly. Word of mouth can be so successful when you're talking, like you say, perhaps in the same language. But when you try to go overseas, even a neighboring country, it can also become, extremely challenging very quickly. So the cultural differences are massive.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point, Emil and Peter, that, it's critical really to have people on the ground locally who can champion your product. So it's important to be seen and known at the larger conferences, the European, broader European conferences, in the US as well. I think having a presence in the US can be helpful in the European market as well. But it's really important to have local representatives who can talk about your product or and employ your product in their own language, and with people who trust them, right? You need trusted partners, and people are not that barrier to adoption, especially in the realm of technology, where things are new and people are a little suspicious to begin with because they don't know how much they can trust technology. Having that information come from someone that they trust as a colleague and a professional makes a big difference.
Yeah, definitely. And that's one of the things that I see quite often. You might have a fantastic product that adds so much value or can add so much value day to day to a radiologist for sure. But it's that skepticism of, should I adopt, my colleague that I know or have known for 20 years, is not actually that interested. So that makes me feel as though, maybe I don't want to as well. As a consultant radiologist yourself, have you experienced that?
Oh, yes, I think that's definitely true. And I think, I've seen that in the US as well. There are and I think there are some competing things. And I'm sure this is true in the European market as well. And it gets back to sort of understanding what the challenges are. In the U.S. often, and in smaller practices, the clinical volume is so high that people, although they might be interested or think of themselves as forward-thinking, early adopters of things, their day-to-day reality is they don't have time, and they say, "Well, that would be great, but you bring it to me when it's fully baked. So the testing phase of trying things out and helping shape them to the product that you want is often kind of pushed to the side. And I think having and not having examples, like you said, of a trusted person who's using that, that you can say, oh yeah, they integrated it, I think I'll give it a try, can be a challenge. And I think the financial investment in trying, bringing on a new product is also daunting to smaller groups. And I think that's a big question in Europe too, right? Who's going to pay to bring this on and try it out, right? Is it the national healthcare system? Do they even have the money to do that? Or is it going to be on your private practice side? A lot of physicians work both in the public sector and in the private sector. Are they going to put out the money to bring that product on?
Peter, I know that regulation and reimbursement is a topic that you might be quite hot on. What are your sort of thoughts on that area?
Yeah, I think it comes back to my earlier statement, right? You got 44 countries in Europe, basically, and each country has its own reimbursement system. Yeah, so Germany has a totally different reimbursement system than France. So you could be very successful in France with your product because the insurance accepts your products and even has a payment for it. But that doesn't mean that you can do the same in Germany. In Germany, you will have to go through the whole process again of getting a reimbursement number and a payment against it. And the payments might be different. Just an idea of like an MRI. In the United States, it's a free economy, and most imaging centers are privately owned. So they set their own pricing for an MRI, and at the moment, an MRI is 10 times more expensive in the US than it is in Europe. Yeah, so an MRI in the US would simply cost over $1,000, whereas in Europe, in most countries, you get anywhere between 150 and 250 euros. Yeah. So that also means that the way you position your product needs to be different. Because if you compare, Quibbin is doing artificial intelligence, we do post-processing. If we would charge 100 euros per patient for a post-processing, that is almost the same price what you get for the exam. And in the US, because you charge $1,000 or $1,500, the 100 is not a big ticket. It's not a high price for that. Whereas in Europe, it's going to almost be 50% of the total cost of the exam. So it doesn't. So the whole reimbursement and the way you position your product and financially, but also how you convince hospitals or radiologists in this case to use your product is different. The approach is different. And this also then applies to all the different countries because the workflow is different. The reimbursement is different. The hospital, the whole healthcare system, the way it's built up is different. Most countries in Europe are based on a socialized healthcare system, but still the differences is that some hospitals are getting paid per procedure. In other countries, hospitals are getting paid in a lump sum per year, and they have to run their business for the year. Yeah. So also the reimbursement per exam is different. And you need to figure that out before you enter a country, how you're going to position your product and how you're going to price your product.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I've seen experiences of, obviously speaking with people through hiring processes or whatever it might be, saying, the price that they have in their domestic country, honestly, it's not going to work in Spain or, wherever we are. It's so different. They probably should rethink that. And that is, a massive barrier because that's ultimately stopping you from entering into different markets because you want your price to fit because it's what works for your margins. But realistically, that market is not going to accept it if that is the case. And, looking at, I suppose, the different markets then, how we mentioned feet on the ground can be really important. And it's something that is discussed a lot. from both of your perspectives, Peter, maybe starting with you, because you have probably more experience maybe building out commercial teams. How important, or what is the dynamic of having feet on the ground? We talk about the different channels, so a direct sales and salespeople in each region. We obviously have major manufacturers who we work with as partners or distributors. What's your thoughts on the approach there, and what is best, I suppose?
Yeah, I think there is a would like to have and a can have here in this question, right? I think you probably want someone representing your company directly in each country, because you want to understand the culture, you want to understand the language, and people need to be able to visit your customer and talk to them. It's still very much in Europe, it's very much relationship selling. Still, it's all about who you know and what kind of relationship you have with your customer. And like I said, with these 44 different countries, most companies cannot afford 44 sales reps and having a rep in each country. And then, so the best way to do is you have to find the balance. You need to do this focused. This is the way I see it. You start small, you focus on a country where you think that your product fits best in the current environment. Have someone locally there that will actually position your product in that particular country. And when you're successful, that means that you can go to the next. If you try to enter Europe as a whole, you're going to spread your resources too much. You're going to be all over the place. And because of the different cultures and the different reimbursements, you're not going to achieve anything. You're going to have a customer here and a customer there, which is not working. So So again, if you want to have a fast approach into the European market, then the best way is to go with distributors. The problem with distributors is that they will not put all their energy and focus on your product, right? So the uptake will be slower, but it costs you less in resources. And I think in that case, if you have a few people that will manage your distributors in Europe, then you can handle more territory. Yeah. So it's a matter, how much clout do you have? How much, how deep your pockets are, and how fast do you want to enter the market, basically.
There's definitely a balance there. Rachel, before we come to you, I can see that there are already some really great questions in the chat. Obviously, we'll address as many of them as possible during the Q&A later on, but please keep them coming. Rachel, your perspective.
This is going a little away from the specific question there, but again, I think identifying the problem you're solving and the value that you're creating for a healthcare system is really important. So one of the challenges in Europe, in my experience in working as a radiologist in Europe versus in the US, are different in terms of issues of backlog, turnaround times. So what are you trying to triage? Are you trying to catch up on backlog work? Are you trying to make the system more efficient? Are you trying to solve part of the problem of not having enough radiologists, which is a challenge in areas both in Europe and in the US? So with identifying that problem and selling that value helps address, I think, some of the financial issues that Peter was talking about, right? And can you say to the national healthcare system that, yes, this is going to be a financial investment, and I think there's real challenges that Peter highlighted so nicely about reimbursement and the added cost of some of these tools, but is it going to solve your problem of hundreds of thousands of x-rays that haven't been read, right, that are sitting waiting for a radiologist, or have no one local to look at them? So that using technology and the teleradiology aspect, the AI aspect, does your tool help eliminate unnecessary studies so that volume goes down? I'm just brainstorming about what some of those solutions might be, but selling that value and targeting it to the healthcare system that you're working in, I think is really critical.
Picking on your experience, what kind of, or have you seen solutions or been exposed to solutions where you do find that that is the case? There is a benefit, because today, the teleradiology, there's lots of different companies, and the same with AI as well, who are creating new solutions to bring to market. And you think, are all of these, if one doctor had all of these, is it actually going to help them, or is there a burden? And that's obviously a question that is ongoing. From your perspective, where is the benefit?
Well, I think you raise a great point, right? Are we adding burden? I sit at a desk that has, 10 monitors sometimes already, right? If I have to integrate, if every solution is an add-on to the system I'm already using, and I look at a study and then I have to move to a different set of monitors to run it through the next algorithm, right? That doesn't help me, right? And they don't always play nicely together. I mean, it's a real challenge having multiple solutions that don't talk to each other well, because ultimately I have to produce a report. And even just yesterday at work, we were having a struggle with this, with an ultrasound report that comes out of the ultrasound machine looking beautiful and easy to read, but it doesn't transmit into my report software nicely, and it's almost unreadable just in its formatting, right? So I think that that's another really important thing to think about, and also a strategy, right? Maybe you want a broad portfolio, so you have multiple solutions that all run on your platform, or maybe you want a platform that can use other people's solutions, that you can, so it has your solution, but it's also able to interact with other people's solutions. And I think you need that broad approach, because no one can buy 15, one tool from you for diagnosis of intracranial hemorrhage, and one tool for you for identifying lung nodules. And, there's not enough financial wherewithal nor actual ability to interact with those tools if there's 25 of them. No. So I think that's really important.
And Peter, from your commercial perspective of bringing, we're focusing, honing in on AI, which is no surprise that this was going to happen, to the market. How important is utilizing the marketplaces that exist and the platforms which hold a number of different algorithms in one place to break down those barriers that exist in entering the European market?
Yes, good question. I think everyone is still looking for the answer of that. Definitely. We have two challenges, right? I think, we had this discussion earlier, Emil, about, what is successful, right? And I think at the moment, I wouldn't say that a single marketplace has been very successful. There is no mass adaptation. There is no mass usage on these marketplaces. I think one of the issues that we see, and I'm looking at Rachel as well, is how do you choose your best solution? And I think that question is not being answered by the marketplaces. The marketplaces is still a collection of all these different tools, and as a hospital and as a radiologist, you still have to go in and do your own research in your own sort of trials and errors in finding which one works best for you, and which you can actually which one you will rely on. So it doesn't take away the choices on the product that are out there, and it doesn't filter any of the quality of the products out there. The only thing that it will solve is the connectivity issues that we have. Instead of having 20 different vendors going and talking to your IT department and to your PACS vendors about connectivity and if they can accept the data or can they send the data, this is now handled by one vendor. That it's solving that, but I think the choice of AI and how to implement it and how to use it and can you trust it is still not being answered by these marketplaces. So I think the verdict is still out how this is going to work and how this is going to be filtered out over the years. And then the models of the marketplaces are different as well. Some marketplaces are really a one-stop shop where you do everything. You do the contracts with them, you do the pricing with them, the sales, everything is done in marketplace. Other marketplaces are nothing more than a channel. They're being an agent where you still, as a vendor, you still have to work directly with the hospitals and the clinics. And the marketplace is nothing more than a transporter of data. I think, like I said, the verdict is still out if these marketplaces are going to work.
And even in some instances, the competition comes from the marketplaces, because the majority of the ones that exist did not start off by being an app store, right? They started off by developing their own algorithms, in a disease area, and then obviously went from there when, things maybe weren't going as smooth as they might have initially thought it was going to. So there's always an element of competition, creating algorithms side by side. A purely sort of app store based vendor, maybe there's a gap there. So we mentioned a lot of the challenges. We've mentioned a lot of the challenges in expanding into Europe, and obviously one of the hot topics from my side is of course in hiring. I experience a lot of challenging hires for sure, and difficulty bringing people on every now and then. But from your perspectives, what is the key difficulties when looking to hire into different markets, and the challenges that you can experience in those areas?
Is the question to me? Sorry, man.
Yeah, Peter, if you kick us off.
Yeah. So there's quite a bit of challenges. Let's focus again on the AI market, right, and the software market. The average ticket prices, or the customer price for an AI solution, is lower than, let's say, in the capital equipment, right? You go and sell an MRI, can go up to $1.5 million, but it takes you 2 years, maybe 3 years. My experience that AI you will sell maybe for anywhere 20, 30,000 per year, but it can also take 1 or 2 years, which means that your salespeople need to be used to that. They have to be able to build that relationship and keep it going for that time. To order to go to all the processes, do all the trials and the testing, keep in touch with them and make sure that it gets in the budget. So if you come from a capital equipment side, you're used to jump in your car and visit your customer 10, 20 times. Well, if you sell a product for 20,000, you cannot jump in your car and visit them 20, 30 times, but you still have to, keep that relationship going over 1 or 2 years. So it requires a different type of salesperson, and it's different type of sales technique. And then on top of that is, like we mentioned, with all the different cultures and the language, you cannot just hire, I would love to have a salesperson that has like at least 10, 12 languages, so I can put them in a bigger territory, but it just, they're not there, right? So you and I think it's important that if a salesperson speaks the language. Most radiologists do speak or understand English, but still, if you want to build a relationship and you want to sell a product, it needs to be in the local language. They need to build that trust, and they need to be comfortable in understanding what they need, to tell what they need, and to understand what you are selling. And I think a local language is very important. So I think, in the challenges is that, there's not many people that have a lot of experience in selling AI and software, and the people that are selling software are selling the bigger packages, and I'm thinking more like in PACS environment. So it's a totally different sales, a different price category, so there are definitely some challenges in hiring and finding the right people.
So one of the things I wanted to cover was just about the timeline, really, for companies looking to come to Europe or expand across Europe, in terms of the in terms of how quickly they can, realistically expect success, right? And we've mentioned a few of the things about what success means. So it'd be good to hear from both of you, maybe starting with Rachel, about how you would define success, first of all, or as best as possible for a company looking to do, exactly this, and then also, the timelines as well associated.
Yeah, I don't think we know exactly what success is going to look like, especially with sort of at this early phase of integrating AI type tools into workflows and into practices. I think getting people to be willing to try them is even a measure of success, of willing to say, yep, I'm going to take on this tool and see what it does for me, even before they know what it is, that they want from that tool. I think that's a measure of success. I think targeting companies that have, and this is true in the US as well, companies that cross national barriers in Europe that are, I think teleradiology is a great place for trying out some of these tools, because teleradiology companies tend to have a broader reach in the US across states and hospitals, in Europe across countries, like the telemedicine clinic where I worked. And so they're often better positioned for trying out some of these tools because they already have a very tech heavy system, and they already have relationships across countries. So getting people who are willing, getting even just to have those systems in place on a trial basis is really a measure of success, because I think that really speaks to the getting people to trust technology, right? Because that's really a large barrier. What does it take for someone psychologically, both on the physician side and the healthcare side, but also on the patient side, to say, I'm willing to allow this machine to look at my images, to have a say in how quickly something's read, or even what whether a nodule has grown, those kinds of things. I hesitate to use the word diagnosis because we sort of shy away from that still. But that level of trust, but getting people, I think the first hurdle is getting people to say, yep, I'm willing to give it a try and see what happens.
And Peter, from your perspective?
Yeah, I have to agree. I mean, AI has been really a hot topic, right? I mean, if you go into the RSNA for the last 5-6 years, it's all about AI. So it's definitely a hot topic. Do we have really, companies that have been really successful and say like, okay, there is mass adaptation? No, but we see other companies that have been pretty successful. I think if you have, over 500-600 customers worldwide that are using your solution, I would say that you've been pretty successful. And I think being successful also means that paying customers. I think that is also another measure of being success. That a customer is willing to pay for your solutions is already a success, I think, because that means there is a value for your product. Yeah, there is a need for your product, and if customers can find it, then there's definitely other customers who can follow suit and will start to realize that there is a value for your product. Yeah. But you have to be in it for the long haul. Yeah. Your product on the market is not going to happen in a couple of years. Yeah. Don't think you're going to enter the European market and you're going to be successful under what the definition you want it to be. You're not going to be successful in 2 or 3 years. This is going to take longer.
No, exactly. And I think we've mentioned before, and it's definitely a conversation I have often, is when bringing people into the company, managing their expectations. As an example, 12-18 months is what it's going to be like before you see money coming off the back of revenues that you are generating. Peter, maybe from your insights, in that short to medium term, what are the types of revenues that can be generated, like with AI, rather than like full paying customers, through don't know, I suppose clinical trials or partnerships with pharma or grants, these types of things, are those sort of like short-term revenue streams, or are they equally as long-term as the others?
No, it's difficult. Like Rachel mentioned as well. I mean, successful is also if your customer is willing to try it. So sure. I think, if you enter the market the first year and a half, all you're going to do is free installations, free trials. So don't expect too much revenue. Yeah. Then you start getting revenue. Like I said, and this depends on the AI, the type of AI you're doing. There's screening where AI can support, and so there's volume, right? So then the amount of money that you generate is just basically purely on volume. But there is also, and there's plenty of examples. I think there's almost a dozen companies now that are doing neuroradiology support on, let's say, MS and lesion detection. These numbers are much lower. I mean, we're talking about maybe 400 or 500 cases per year. So you're not going to do it on the volume. So that means that the price is going to be higher per exam in order to make money. But the average tickets, it depends on the area, right? It depends on the clinical area and the volume that you will generate. But if a company is doing, I would say at this stage, if a company, an AI company is doing 2 or 3 million a year, you're doing okay. Yeah, and I think if you do 2 or 3 million generating revenue in Europe, you're doing okay. That means that you have an established base, and from there, you can grow.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both for those insights so far. I'd like to ask both of you for one piece of advice and one example of a nice to have before we move into the Q&A. Rachel, why don't we kick off with yourself?
I guess I'll come back to where I started in terms of piece of advice, and I think really honing in on a problem that your customer has and would like to solve is really important. And I think sometimes when we talk about AI in radiology, we focus on the kind of diagnostic side. Can the machine read your image? Right. And I think there's a lot of trust issues from the radiologists and also fear of, oh, is this going to take over the work that I do, that kind of thing. And also, boy, that's not the thing I struggle with in my day-to-day, right? So taking the time to go and sit with the radiologists or to see their workflow. How does it actually work? Wow, do I have a solution? I always think of the breadth of solutions that could be out there that go beyond just image detection and image reading to think about. Obviously, there's triage, but there's also following lesions year to year, so accurate measurement, creating reports that take out some of the tedium of measuring individual lesions that are done by hand and that aren't necessarily done consistently from year to year, triggering and generating appropriate follow-up recommendations for standardization to making sure that people are adhering to guidelines, those kinds of things, even appropriate ordering, flagging cases that are might be ordered inappropriately so that by the time the patient arrives, the correct study is ready to be done and they're appropriately prepped. So I think it's important to think broadly, and of course some people listening probably already have their solutions on the way, but really thinking about how does this solution fit in to solve a problem? Because I think you can generate value and trust in that way by demonstrating that you save time for someone, that you make their day less frustrating, that you make sure that the patient is having an appropriate follow-up or appropriate care. So I think there's lots of ways to measure value, and I don't think we always focus on those. So that's my piece of advice.
Okay. And Peter?
Yeah, I just wrote down 3 words that I think that I would advise people is: 1, go in for the long haul. Don't think you have a quick win, right? Really commit to it, which means that if you're a US company and you want to take over Europe, don't send one person in Europe and let them do the business in Europe, because it's not going to work. right? So you really commit with resources and focus. And I think that focus is probably the most important one. You cannot go enter 44 countries at once. Yeah. So pick a few where you want to be, that fits your strategy, that fits your product, that fits the clinical need in that market. Because the clinical need is not the same in every country in Europe. Yeah. And if you do the focus, then you go in and really commit. So put resources in place that can actually help and support your customer. Provide enough training. Connect the systems. Make sure that it fits within the workflow, that people understand how to use your product. And like I said, it's going to be for the long haul, right? I mean, one customer doesn't mean that you're successful in this country.
No, exactly. Well, thank you for that summary, both of you, with the sort of final points there. I'd like to move into the Q&A, and we will move into some questions. The questions are great. We have a few to look at. First of all, from Sina, she says, I'd love to know the speaker's expertise on the most effective sales and prospecting strategy for the US versus Europe in the healthcare market and decision makers in hospital settings. What works better, a cold outreach through emails and LinkedIn and cold calls, or a cold outreach by the means of traditional physical approach for sales reps for market entry? I guess that means more face-to-face meetings.
Yeah. I think, I remember that I started working for a US company many years ago, and my boss at that time kept calling me every week, and he said, okay, how many cold calls did you do this week? And I was like, okay, I called Italy and I got the secretary on the line, and she didn't understand a word I was saying because, my English is very poor. Her English was poor, so my Italian was poor, so there was no communication. Sure. So, after 50 cold calls, you give up. So cold calling in Europe doesn't work unless you speak the language. Yeah. You speak the language, but you still need an entry. So, someone needs to refer you. So the best way to do is start with a physician that refers you to another physician, does an introduction, okay, and then you can reach out. But just cold calling doesn't work. And we had that before, we said the different cultures, and I think in most countries in Europe, it's still about relationships. So you do have to go and see these people. Yeah. Introduce yourself, you meet, and then you go and say, hey, can we meet in person? And then you build a relationship. And then the next time you can call. But a first call, I guess it doesn't work well within Europe.
Rachel, and I would echo. Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, and I think in the US as well. I mean, there's no replacement for networking, for real networking between people that or who know someone that I think and I think that gets back to this question of trust, right? And it's doubly important it's true in everything, but in this area of sort of new technology, it's even more important because people don't even know they're looking for these products. They're skeptical about them. They're nervous about trusting them. And so having that personal relationship just adds a component of trust that I think is irreplaceable with just a cold call.
Yeah. And you have the conversation between radiologists, right? They meet, they talk, and so they will tell as well their experience. And so if one person says, I got a good experience, the other person goes, okay, so who have you been using, who have you been talking to? And then they're willing to take a call. But radiologists now are too busy. They will not take cold calls from persons they've never met and they don't know. You won't even get past the secretary in most cases.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Obviously, it's a lot of part of the role that I take up. Reaching out to people in this way, and the face-to-face meetings that I have are invaluable by comparison to Teams or calls. Whether it be cold or warm, the face-to-face is always much better. And
that comes to your question earlier. Sorry, Emil. That comes to your question earlier. Like you said, in the recruiting, what challenges do you face? So it would be great, by hiring people that know the market, that have been in the radiology space, that know these physicians, so they can actually go walk into a department and approach someone. Yeah, so they already built a trust with the customer in the past, and you know, I think that's also put value in finding the right person.
Definitely. We have a question from Kavi, who is the director of a teleradiology company in India. He would like to know what are the regulations for radiologists with respect to radiology reporting in the US and Europe, or one versus the other. Can an Indian doctor provide primary readings? Is there an acceptable market for these primary reads? Rachel, do you want to kick us off with that one?
So the rules are quite strict in the US. You actually have to, the original teleradiology was a U.S. company based in Australia and Switzerland, with U.S. doctors reading from those places, and that to provide a final read, that you can't do that anymore. Medicare in the U.S. will not pay unless you're on U.S. soil. So you can be in Guam or on a U.S. military base, but otherwise you have to be physically on U.S. soil to provide a final interpretation, no matter where you're from. And you also need to have a US license. And that's true, actually, even if you're reading for Europe and you have a European license. If you're on US soil, you need to have a US license to practice medicine, even though your reports are not for US patients. So there are, American radiologists do travel overseas and provide preliminary interpretations for the US, but you have to have a US license to provide any interpretation for a US market. And actually that's true as well in Europe, as far as I know. Certainly for my own licensing, I had to have a local license to provide interpretation for European market.
Yeah. And Peter, anything from your side on that? Any additional insights?
No, I know the teleradiology market is growing, right? And the demand is growing because there's a big shortage of radiologists. And Emil, you're in the UK. I think the UK last year spent 160 million pounds on teleradiology services.
Yeah.
And most of these services are actually going to Asia or Australia. Also because of the language. I think this is also important, that the read needs to be in the local language.
Yeah.
I know that, and then Rachel, you did a lot of reads, and I think in the Nordics, teleradiology is very well accepted as well. I think in the other countries, they're self-sustainable, so they have enough radiologists. But the Nordics and the UK, I think, are the highest teleradiology services or users of teleradiology services at the moment.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Hopefully that answers your question, Kavi. So we have a question here. If you have a salesperson knowing 10 languages, Peter, this one's directed at you, I would say. Do you still pay him the same, or are you paying a premium for the language knowledge?
Yeah, actually, fair question. I wouldn't hire that person as a salesperson. Looking at their experience. But if you speak 10 languages, you're more like almost like a European manager overseeing, several distributors. I wouldn't make him a country or regional salesperson. That would be a waste of all the languages.
Sure.
So, with that different role, there's also a different salary. Yeah. If you have more responsibility and a larger territory, the salary will be increased as well.
Yeah. No, exactly. And from my perspective, I think that in the event of hiring, this person, it's in balance, right? So you may know 10 languages, he or she may know 10 different languages, but actually that's in balance. Like you said before, do they actually know radiology? Are they from this space? Do they have the right skills to fit within the team? Do they match the team culturally? These different aspects. So it's not a one size fits all. If they bring a certain amount of credits in one area, that you pay them a certain salary, right? It's a balance, I think.
it's a balance about knowledge, and expertise, right?
Yeah.
If you have a linguistics person with 10 languages but never worked in the medical industry,
Yeah.
I'm not even sure I would hire them just based on the language skills, right? So
no, exactly. We have a question from Biagio. How do we convince expert doctors to give us their time with the likes of annotations or data analysis? Typically, medical doctors are focused on their career within the hospital and their day-to-day job. On one side, offering money is not appealing to most. On another side, they're not attracted to long-term objectives, perhaps like the development of new AI. Any suggestions? And Rachel, will throw this one your way.
Yeah, I think that's a real challenge, although I do think it's shifting. I think there is a growing interest among physicians in AI, partially driven out of interest and opportunity for their own personal growth, but also a little bit out of fear, like what this is coming. How is it going to impact me? I want to be ahead of the curve in doing that. So identifying those people sometimes can be challenging, I think. And as I referred to a little bit before, I think sometimes people are interested, but they're just drinking from a fire hose when it comes to their clinical work. So they sort of don't have time to answer the phone or lift their head up to say, sure, I'll spend a day trying out this new tool that might throw off my whole work day from what I'm used to. So I think that can be a challenge. Again, I think having opportunities at big conferences for demonstration, obviously, I mean, that seems like an obvious one, but where you can really try something out, see how it would, again, impact your actual day-to-day. I think that's critical. And I think really presenting it's a challenge, and I think this is true in the US as well as in Europe. A lot of the decisions of who's going to buy these products or the mass adoption come from larger healthcare systems, and yet what drives those systems, healthcare systems, to look for those products is a physician asking for them, for a physician saying, I've used this, we need this makes things better for us, for our patients. So I think that it's super important to identify individuals within healthcare systems who are willing to give this a try. And I think, again, selling it not just on what it can do for them, right? As with any product, it's important to identify what it can do for them.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, that seems like a great place to leave it today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And obviously, a massive thanks to today's panel. You've both been fantastic. Apologies if we've not been able to address all of the questions. I'm sure if you drop myself or either of our panelists a question, we'll be happy to respond to you with an answer. A video recording of this discussion will be released soon, as well as a downloadable PDF featuring today's main takeaways. So obviously keep an eye out for that in your emails. That will come through shortly. Finally, if you have any upcoming hiring projects and would like to find out more about CM Medical and the expertise that we have in talent solutions for medical imaging and the wider medtech space, then obviously reach out through a message, email, LinkedIn, whatever it may be, or go to searchingmedical.com and we'll be happy to help. Anyway, that is it from me. Thank you again for attending to our panelists, and have a fantastic day. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for attending.
Thank you.